The funeral home smelled like lilies and polished wood, a heavy, suffocating perfume that clung to every breath I took. I stood near Charles's casket, numb, holding on to the edge of the podium for balance as the murmurs of the crowd blurred into background noise. It was supposed to be a day of mourning, a day to honor the man I had built my life around. Instead, it became the day I truly saw him for who he had been. The church doors creaked open, and when I turned, I saw her, Vanessa Hart. She strolled in like she owned the room, wearing a fire-red dress that clashed violently with the somber blacks and grays around her. Heads turned, whispers ignited. My heart skipped a beat, then slammed painfully against my ribs. She met my gaze across the aisle, her lips curling into a slow, deliberate smirk, the kind someone gives when they think they've won. Like she was the true wife now, like my pain was her trophy. I could feel the eyes of the mourners shift between us, hungry for a scene, for drama, for anything to tear into later. My fingers tightened around my handbag. For a split second, the old me, the one who would shrink away, who would cry quietly in a bathroom stall, who would pretend it didn't hurt, threatened to take over. But not today. I inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a thick wool blanket. Vanessa took a few arrogant steps forward, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume, sharp and sweet like overripe fruit. She tilted her head, eyebrows raised, daring me to crumble. Instead, I smiled. A small, controlled, almost polite smile. Without a word, I unzipped my purse, reached inside, and pulled out the neatly folded document I had tucked there that morning. The paper felt cool and stiff between my fingers, like armor. I held it out to her, steady, unwavering. She hesitated. Then, with a smug flick of her wrist, she plucked it from my hand. Her eyes skimmed the words, and slowly I watched the color drain from her face. The smirk melted away. Her fingers began to tremble. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The truth was there, spelled out in black and white. Turning away, I let the sharp clicks of my heels echo across the marble floor, each step sealing the silence behind me like a closing door. In that moment, I wasn't just Charles's widow. I was something else entirely, something stronger, something reborn. Before everything fell apart, my life with Charles was the kind of story people envied. Or at least, that's what I used to believe. We lived in a cozy 2-story brick house on Willow Lane, the kind of place with a tire swing in the backyard and window boxes that exploded with color every spring. It wasn't grand or glamorous, but it was ours. Every corner of that house held a memory. Late-night talks on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cool air. Lazy Sunday mornings, the smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls drifting through the halls. Charles would tease me, calling me his little dreamer, always finding me with my nose buried in some worn-out book while he mapped out the practical future he was determined to build. I met him when I was just 20, wide-eyed and full of ideas about love and poetry. He was studying business, already with one foot firmly planted in the real world. His confidence anchored me. I believed in him, in us, so deeply that I let my own dreams bend and shift to fit the life we imagined together. After we married, I gave up a scholarship offer to a prestigious graduate program because his new job required us to move across the state. I told myself it was a small sacrifice, one of many we would both make. It felt right then. It felt like love. For years, I found work where I could, tutoring local kids, freelance writing, piecing together odd jobs while Charles climbed the rungs of success. There were seasons that felt like magic, decorating our first Christmas tree with mismatched ornaments, standing barefoot in our tiny kitchen, laughing so hard we cried when our first Thanksgiving turkey came out blackened and smoking. We weren't wealthy, but I believed we were rich in all the ways that mattered. Or so I thought, because sometimes happiness hums so quietly beneath the surface, you don't realize it's slipping away until the silence grows too loud to ignore. Charles had dreams bigger than the life we were living. He worked long hours, chasing promotions, carving out a reputation in the business world, and I was proud of him. I supported every late-night meeting, every sudden business trip, every missed anniversary dinner. I told myself his success was our success. When he came home exhausted and distracted, I brushed it off. It's just part of being ambitious, I thought. It's part of being a man in a world that demands everything. Our relationship was built on small rituals that stitched our lives together. Saturday morning pancakes, late-night grocery runs when we forgot milk, slow Sunday drives even when the price of gas soared. It was in those tiny, ordinary moments that I found my happiness. I thought love was measured not by grand declarations, but by quiet consistency. It wasn't that we didn't argue. We did. Silly things mostly. Who left the porch light on? Who forgot to pick up the dry cleaning? We'd bicker, sulk for an hour, then fall asleep tangled together, all grievances forgotten by morning. That, I thought, was marriage. Imperfect, but enduring. Looking back, the signs were there long before I was willing to see them. The missed calls he brushed off with vague excuses, the business trips that stretched an extra night or two, the way he'd fall silent after certain text messages. His face shuddered in a way I couldn't quite explain. But love can be a stubborn kind of blindness. I wore it like armor, determined to protect the life we had built. Helen, my older sister, tried to nudge me awake once. She never said it outright, just a gentle, worried, "Do you ever wonder about all those late nights, Margie?" I laughed it off, brushing aside her concern like a gnat. "Charlie's just busy," I said. "He's building a future for us." Helen's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't push. She loved me enough to let me hold on to my illusions, even when they started to crack under their own weight, and I held on to them desperately, because the truth was too terrifying to face. I needed to believe that Charles loved me the way I loved him, fully, fiercely, unquestionably, because once you build your world around someone, tearing it down feels like tearing yourself apart. The cruelest betrayals, I would later realize, are the ones you never prepare for, the ones you think you are immune to because you trust too deeply. In those early years, I would have sworn on everything I held sacred that Charles and I were solid, unshakable. I believed in the fairy tale we had spun together, and then came the night of the annual company gala. It was a glittering event held at one of the grandest hotels in town, a celebration of another year of success. Charles was being honored with an award for leadership excellence. I spent the entire afternoon getting ready, curling my hair, slipping into a navy blue dress he once said made my eyes look like sapphires. I wanted to be the woman he was proud to show off. The ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers, tables draped in white linens, wine flowing freely. Charles moved through the crowd like a king, shaking hands, laughing that deep, magnetic laugh that had first drawn me to him. And then I saw her, Vanessa Hart. She was new at the company, the young, beautiful executive assistant everyone whispered about. 10 years younger than me, with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, a body that drew gazes wherever she went. That night, she wore a sleek black dress, more suited for a nightclub than a formal affair. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Assistants attended these events all the time. It wasn't strange. But then I saw the way Charles's eyes lingered on her a fraction too long. how his smile softened when he looked at her, how he introduced her to me not as my assistant, but simply Vanessa, like she needed no explanation. She laughed at something he said, resting her hand lightly, too lightly, on his arm. Not a casual touch, a claim. My stomach twisted, but I forced a smile, extended my hand politely when Vanessa offered hers. "Margaret, right?" she said, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes glinting with something sharper. Pity, amusement, superiority. I swallowed it down, told myself I was imagining things, that Charles loved me, that nothing could change that. Helen, bless her, was my guest that night, sensing my unease almost instantly. She leaned over at one point and whispered, "That's not just business, Margie. Look at the way she watches him." I shook my head, brushing it off with a brittle laugh. "She's just young and eager," I said. "He's her boss." Helen didn't argue. She just gave me that look, the kind older sisters have when they know you're lying to yourself, but love you too much to rip your illusions away. Later that evening, as Charles stood at the podium basking in applause, I sat at our table, hands folded tightly in my lap. He spoke eloquently, thanking his colleagues, his mentors, even Vanessa, mentioning her by name, for her tireless support during a challenging year. He did not mention me, not once, not the woman who had followed him across states, not the woman who had given up dreams, stitched together jobs, made a life so he could chase his ambition. I clapped when everyone else clapped. I smiled when he returned to our table, glowing with pride. But inside, something small and essential shifted, a tiny crack in the foundation I thought was unbreakable. That night, lying next to Charles in bed, I stared at the ceiling long after he fell into an easy sleep. I thought about Vanessa's hand on his arm, about the empty space where my name should have been in his speech, about the way he had smiled at her, softer than he smiled at me. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was tired, that the night had been overwhelming for both of us, but the first seed of doubt had been planted, and even though I buried it deep beneath excuses and hopeful prayers, it took root, growing silently, invisibly, waiting for the moment when it would split my heart wide open. The days that followed were quieter, not outwardly colder. Charles still came home, still pecked me on the cheek, still slept beside me. But there was a distance, a withdrawal. It was like living with a ghost. I noticed the small things first, how he stopped asking about my day, how he seemed to text more often, smiling at messages I couldn't see, how he grew impatient when I asked simple questions, brushing me off like a fly he was too busy to swat. I told myself marriage had seasons, that this was just a hard winter we would survive together. But deep down, I was beginning to understand the truth. I was surviving alone. I tried to save us the only way I knew how, by giving more patience, more forgiveness, more of myself. I cooked his favorite meals, even when I wasn't hungry. I surprised him with little notes tucked into his work bag. I dressed up for date nights he increasingly canceled. I smiled even when the loneliness gnawed at my ribs like hunger. But love cannot survive on sacrifice alone, and the harder I tried, the more invisible I seemed to become. There were no dramatic confrontations, no screaming matches in the kitchen, just silence, heavy and cold, like fog filling every corner of our house. One evening, sitting across from him at the dinner table, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest for a month. "Charlie," I said, voice small, careful, "are you happy?" He didn't even look up from his phone. "Yeah," he said, his thumb still tapping the screen. "Why wouldn't I be?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and smiled, because what else was there to do? Argue with a man who no longer saw you? Beg for attention from someone who had already moved his heart elsewhere? That night, after he fell asleep, I lay awake listening to the rhythm of his breathing, steady, untroubled, and I realized, with a kind of hollow certainty, that somewhere along the way I had lost not just my husband, but myself. The woman who used to dream, to laugh too loud, to love with reckless hope, she was fading a little more every day. And Charles either didn't notice or he simply didn't care. Helen saw it before I did. One rainy afternoon, she showed up at my door holding 2 cups of coffee, her smile tight with worry. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Charles and I had once dreamed about future vacations, new homes, babies we never had. She reached across and took my hand, her fingers warm and solid. "You're fading, Margie," she said softly. "You're not you anymore." I laughed weakly, brushing her off. "It's just a rough patch," I insisted. "Every marriage goes through them." Helen didn't argue. She just squeezed my hand tighter, her eyes shimmering with the sadness she wouldn't speak aloud. After she left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the untouched coffee growing cold in front of me. Helen's words echoed in my mind, stubborn and persistent. "You're fading." And deep down, I knew it was true. I had been shrinking myself to fit into the narrow spaces Charles still offered me, spaces getting smaller and smaller with every passing day. I stopped sharing my little victories with him because they were met with distracted nods. I stopped suggesting weekend plans because he always had work or was too tired. I stopped reaching for him at night because the space between us felt too vast, too cold. I became a ghost in my own marriage, moving through the motions, smiling at the right moments, pretending everything was fine when inside I was crumbling. I told myself that marriage meant endurance, that if I just held on long enough, tried hard enough, loved fiercely enough, he would find his way back to me. But love, real love, should not feel like shouting into an empty canyon. It should not feel like begging for scraps of affection at the table you helped build. And somewhere inside, a small, stubborn part of me, the part that still remembered who I used to be, began to stir. The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no thunderclap of realization, no grand moment of defiance. It was quieter than that, a slow, aching understanding that seeped into my bones like winter. The final fracture came at my parents' 40th wedding anniversary party. It was a beautiful evening, string lights twinkling in the backyard, laughter mingling with the soft hum of an old record player spinning classics. I had spent weeks helping Helen plan every detail because, if I couldn't save my own marriage, I could at least honor theirs. Charles came late, offering a rushed apology and a distracted kiss on my cheek. I wanted so badly for that night to be different, to pretend, even for just a few hours, that we were still us. But when I saw him across the lawn, laughing a little too easily, leaning in a little too close, and there, standing beside him, was Vanessa. Uninvited, unwelcome, wrapped in a dress that clung to her like a second skin, holding a glass of wine as if she had every right to be there. My chest tightened painfully. This wasn't a work event. This was family. This was sacred, and he had brought her anyway. When he noticed me watching, Charles didn't even look guilty. He smiled and beckoned me over with a casual flick of his hand, like he was calling over the help. "This is Vanessa," he said, slinging an arm around her slender shoulders. "My assistant couldn't have survived this year without her." I nodded stiffly, extending a hand Vanessa barely bothered to shake. And this, Charles continued, gesturing toward me without even meeting my eyes, is Margaret. She keeps things running at home. There was laughter, light, dismissive, thoughtless. I stood there, cheeks burning, heart splintering, while my family, my friends, my world blurred into a noisy, indifferent background. He hadn't just forgotten me. He had erased me. I excused myself as gracefully as I could, my hands trembling so hard I nearly dropped my glass. Inside the house, I locked the bathroom door behind me and leaned heavily against it, my breath coming in shallow bursts. In the mirror, a stranger stared back at me. Her lipstick was smudged. Her hair had lost its careful curl, and her eyes, oh, her eyes, were hollow, rimmed with unshed tears and silent screams. I gripped the sink until my knuckles turned white, fighting back the urge to crumble completely. Not here, not tonight, not when my parents deserved a celebration untouched by my sadness. So I painted on a smile. I reapplied my lipstick with a shaking hand. I straightened my dress and pushed my shoulders back, and I stepped back out into the night like a woman wearing a costume stitched from the remnants of who she used to be. Helen caught my eye across the yard later, her expression soft and knowing. She said nothing. She didn't need to. In that moment, her silent understanding was the only thing holding me together. I moved through the rest of the evening like a ghost. I laughed when expected. I clapped for speeches. I posed for family photos, standing beside Charles like we were still a team, but inside, something vital had already broken loose, floating untethered. I wasn't standing at the edge of a crack anymore. I had fallen straight through it. Leaving Charles wasn't a lightning bolt decision. It wasn't cinematic. It was smaller, quieter, like the slow, inevitable shifting of the tide, pulling the sand from beneath your feet. It happened one ordinary night a few weeks later. We sat on opposite ends of the living room. He scrolled mindlessly through his phone. I stared blankly at the muted television. The space between us felt as wide and barren as a desert. Without thinking, I rose from my seat, walked upstairs, pulled a small overnight bag from the closet. I didn't pack much, just a few clothes, my toothbrush, a battered old sweater I loved more than anything else in that house. I wrote a note, short and simple, staying with Helen. Please don't call. I placed it on the dresser. Charles didn't even look up when I walked past him, my bag in hand. Didn't ask where I was going, didn't stop me, and maybe that hurt the most of all. The door closed behind me with a soft click, not a slam, not a shout, just a quiet end to a story that had unraveled long before that night. Helen was waiting for me when I pulled into her driveway, her porch light casting a warm golden halo around her. She didn't bombard me with questions. She didn't ask for explanations I wasn't ready to give. She simply opened her arms, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself collapse into someone else's strength. The tears came then, raw and silent, carving paths down my cheeks, not just for the man I had lost, but for the woman I had abandoned along the way. Helen held me until the shaking stopped. Then she took my bag, set it by the door, and led me inside without a word. That night, I lay awake in the small guest bedroom under a faded quilt, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of life happening around me. It was unfamiliar, lonely, terrifying, but beneath all that, buried so deep I almost missed it, was something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Hope, not the wild, reckless kind I once had, not the fairy tale hope that someone would swoop in and fix everything. No, this was quieter, more stubborn, the kind of hope that comes from knowing you are still breathing, still standing, even when everything else has fallen apart. In the days that followed, I moved through a fog. I barely ate. I barely spoke. Helen hovered nearby, a steady, reassuring presence, never pushing, never prying. The grief was vast and merciless, a constant ache that lived in my chest. But grief, I was learning, is a kind of cleansing. It strips away the lies you tell yourself. It forces you to look at what's left and decide what's worth rebuilding. One gray afternoon, when the sky hung low and heavy over the town, I found myself sitting at Helen's kitchen table, listlessly flipping through the contents of my overnight bag. Tucked at the bottom, hidden beneath the jumble of clothes and toiletries, was a small, battered jewelry box. I didn't even remember packing it. Curious, I opened it, and there, among a few forgotten trinkets, lay the thick envelope Charles's lawyer had given us 2 decades ago. The prenup. Back then, it had seemed like a joke, a meaningless document, something we signed because Charles's parents insisted. We had laughed about it, promised each other it would never matter because our love would never fail. Sitting there in the kitchen, the late afternoon light slanting across the worn wood table, I unfolded the document with trembling hands, and there, buried in the legal jargon, was the clause that changed everything. If Charles ever engaged in an extramarital relationship, he forfeited all claims to jointly held assets. Everything would revert to me. Everything, for the first time in months. I didn't feel powerless. I didn't feel abandoned. I felt strong. I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could survive this after all. Finding that prenup wasn't just discovering a forgotten piece of paper. It was discovering a version of myself I had thought was gone. The woman who once dared to protect her own future, even while in love. I refolded the document carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it into my purse. It felt heavier than it should have, not just in weight, but in meaning. The next morning, with Helen's gentle encouragement, I made a call to a family lawyer she recommended, Sylvia Monroe. Her voice on the phone was calm and steady, the kind of voice that said, "You are not alone in this." We scheduled a meeting for the following week. In the days leading up to it, I moved quietly. I returned to the house while Charles was at work, gathering what few things were truly mine. Old photo albums, books with my name scrawled inside the covers, the quilt my grandmother had made for me before she passed. I didn't linger. I didn't cry over the life that once filled those rooms. I moved like a visitor, walking through the ruins of a city she used to call home. At Helen's suggestion, I also began separating my finances. I opened a checking account in my name alone. Small steps. But each one was a reclaiming. Each one whispered, "You are not powerless. You are not invisible." The day of my meeting with Sylvia, I dressed carefully. Dark jeans, a soft gray sweater, a pair of simple pearl earrings. No armor, no facade, just me. Her office was tucked above a quiet bookstore downtown, the kind of place where the air smelled faintly of old pages and coffee. When I stepped inside, I felt something loosen in my chest. It was the first place I had walked into in months, where I didn't feel like I had to apologize for existing. Sylvia greeted me with a warm smile and a firm handshake. She read the prenup carefully, her eyes sharpening with every page she turned. "You have more leverage than you think, Margaret," she said finally, closing the folder with a soft thud. "If we do this right, Charles won't even see it coming." For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself a small smile. Maybe I had lost my marriage. Maybe I had lost the life I thought I was building. But I hadn't lost myself. Not completely. And from that small, stubborn spark, I would rebuild everything. Sylvia laid out a plan that was clean, sharp, and devastating in its simplicity. First, we would document everything. joint assets, financial movements, signs of Charles's infidelity, no matter how small. Second, we would quietly prepare the necessary filings. No fireworks, no warnings. Timing, she explained, was everything. Let him think he's still in control, Sylvia said, her tone even. The more secure he feels, the less prepared he'll be when you move. I left her office that afternoon, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, empowered. It was subtle at first, the way I began to shift. I stopped checking Charles's social media. I stopped waiting for texts that would never come. I stopped rehearsing imaginary arguments in the shower, the ones where I demanded explanations or apologies. I owed him nothing, not anymore. Instead, I focused on myself, a woman I had neglected for far too long. I returned to tutoring, pouring my energy into helping students who reminded me that success wasn't measured by paychecks or accolades, but by quiet, steady growth. I started volunteering at the local animal shelter on weekends, finding comfort in the unspoken loyalty of creatures who simply needed kindness. Piece by piece, I stitched a new life together. It was still messy. It was still hard. There were nights when the loneliness weighed heavy on my chest, pressing against my ribs until it hurt to breathe. Nights when I wondered if I had made a mistake walking away from everything I knew. But each morning, when I woke up in Helen's spare room to the soft smell of coffee and the promise of an unscripted day, I remembered I had survived the worst already. Everything after was just rebuilding. Charles, meanwhile, remained oblivious. He still posted polished pictures at company events, flashing the same charming smile that had once stolen my heart. Vanessa was always nearby, her presence growing bolder, her ownership of him more obvious. I let them have their illusion, because while they celebrated, I was preparing. While they flaunted, I was reclaiming. True strength, I was learning, doesn't announce itself with noise. It grows quietly, like deep roots burrowing into solid ground, and mine were finally beginning to take hold. The weeks passed in a strange sort of calm. Helen often joked that I had become dangerously peaceful, a quiet storm gathering strength just beyond the horizon. Privately, I kept working with Sylvia, gathering every shred of documentation we might need. Bank statements, emails, even a few careless text messages from Charles that hinted at the nature of his relationship with Vanessa. Each piece of evidence slipped neatly into the file Sylvia kept locked away in her office, each one a tiny stone added to the fortress I was building around myself, and then, without fanfare or warning, it happened. Charles called. I saw his name flash across my phone, and for a moment the old panic flared in my chest, but I forced myself to answer calmly, my voice even. "Margie," he said, and for the first time in months, I heard something unfamiliar in his tone, uncertainty. "I was going through some paperwork. There's a payment missing. Did you forget to pay the mortgage?" I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "No," I said simply. "You'll need to check your account. I'm no longer managing our finances." There was a long, confused pause on the other end. I didn't fill the silence. I let it stretch, let him sit in it. "Is everything okay?" he finally asked, his voice tightening. Everything inside me wanted to scream no. It hasn't been okay for a long time. But I didn't. I just said, "Everything is as it should be." And then I hung up. That small act of detachment, of refusing to scramble and fix things for him, felt like breathing pure cold air after years in a stifling room. From there, the unraveling began faster than I expected. Charles reached out more frequently, each message more strained than the last. First about finances, then about household maintenance, then thinly veiled questions about how I was doing. I answered politely but briefly, never giving him more than necessary, because I wasn't the woman he could take for granted anymore. I was the woman building a life that no longer needed him. Behind the scenes, Sylvia and I finalized everything. All the documents were in order, the proof, the prenup, the legal filings waiting quietly like soldiers ready for battle. We picked the date carefully, a day when we knew Charles would be distracted, a company event where he would be parading his perfect new life for all to see. He wouldn't expect anything. That morning, I dressed simply, a soft navy blouse, black slacks, flats that made no noise when I walked. There was no drama here, no storm clouds, only resolve. Helen hugged me before I left, her arms squeezing just a little tighter than usual. "You've already won, Margie," she whispered, "no matter what happens next." I smiled, feeling her words settle into my bones like a shield. At Sylvia's office, everything moved quickly. I signed the documents that would freeze our joint accounts, protect my interests, and officially initiate the division of assets according to the prenup. Within the hour, notices were sent. Charles would receive them the next day, blindsided in the very life he had built atop my broken heart. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt clear, for the first time in years. Walking out of Sylvia's office, the autumn air bit at my cheeks, sharp and real. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and lifted my face to the sky. I had thought for so long that my story ended with Charles, that without him there was no more happily ever after. But standing there under the wide, indifferent sky, I realized something breathtakingly simple. My story had never been about him. It had always been about me, and I was just getting started. Charles's downfall came faster than anyone expected. Just a few months after I filed, life delivered its own brutal justice, a heart attack, sudden, final. He was gone before he even hit the ground. When Helen called to tell me, I sat very still at her kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. I waited for the wave of grief, the collapse, the aching sobs, but they didn't come. Instead, there was only a heavy, aching emptiness, like standing in the hollowed-out shell of a house after a fire. He was gone, and with him, all the apologies he never gave, all the explanations he never offered, all the closures he had denied me. The funeral was arranged quickly, a polished affair full of carefully curated memories. No one spoke of the cracks beneath the surface. No one dared. I dressed simply that morning, a plain black dress, a simple pearl necklace, the wedding ring still tucked into my jewelry box at Helen's house, untouched. I didn't wear it. Not anymore. As I stepped into the funeral home, the scent of lilies and polished wood hit me like a wave, sickly sweet, suffocating. I moved quietly to a seat near the back, unnoticed by most, and then the doors creaked open. Vanessa Hart strode in, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, her black dress far too tight, her expression far too smug for a day of mourning. Heads turned. Whispers ignited. I felt the eyes shift, felt the heat of them pressing against my skin. Vanessa's gaze found mine across the room. Her lips curled into a slow, deliberate smirk, the same smirk she had worn at the gala, the same smirk she had worn at my parents' anniversary party. The smirk of someone who thought she had won. But she didn't know. Not yet. I rose from my seat, calm, steady. My heels clicked against the floor as I crossed the room, the silence around us thick and expectant. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folded document, the prenup that had become my sword and shield. Without a word, I extended it to her. Vanessa hesitated, confusion flickering in her heavily made-up eyes. She took the paper, unfolding it with a practiced flick of her wrist. I watched her face pale. watched her smirk crumble. The words on that paper spelled the end of every dream she had built on my broken life. She glanced up at me, her mouth opening, closing, no words finding their way out. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I turned and walked away, the door swinging closed behind me, sealing her and everything she represented firmly in the past. The sun hit my face as I stepped outside, warm and bright against the cool air. I wasn't Charles's widow. I wasn't Vanessa's rival. I was Margaret Whitman, whole, free. Finally, irrevocably free. The days after the funeral passed in a quiet, almost reverent peace. No chaos, no anger, no desperate late-night phone calls. Just silence. I spent the days tying up the loose ends, meetings with Sylvia to finalize the estate, sorting through documents Charles had left behind, signing papers that closed one chapter and opened another. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. For the first time in years, time belonged to me. At the reading of the will, Vanessa showed up wearing a black suit and dark sunglasses, as if mourning could be manufactured. She sat stiffly in the corner, clutching her handbag like a life raft. The lawyer, a kind, gray-haired man named Mr. Templeton, read through the standard provisions first. Small donations to charities, a few heirlooms passed to distant relatives, and then the part everyone had been waiting for, the estate, the money, the house, everything Charles had worked for. Mr. Templeton cleared his throat and said almost gently, "According to the prenuptial agreement signed in 2003 and pursuant to evidence of extramarital conduct, the entirety of the estate is to pass to Mrs. Margaret Whitman." Silence fell over the room like a weighted blanket. Vanessa's face drained of color. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and desperate. "There must be a mistake," she hissed. "Charles promised me." Mr. Templeton looked at her kindly but firmly. "I'm sorry, Miss Hart. Promises made outside the bounds of legal documentation hold no weight here." And just like that, everything she thought she had won slipped through her fingers like sand. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply rose, gathered my belongings, and walked out into the golden afternoon, feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because I had won, but because I had chosen myself, and finally learned that was victory enough. Life after Charles didn't snap into place like flipping a switch. It unfolded slowly, tenderly, like the first blooms of spring after a brutal winter. I stayed with Helen a few months longer, using that time to figure out not just where I wanted to live, but who I wanted to be. I started tutoring more, pouring my heart into helping kids who reminded me that growth is never wasted. I adopted a senior dog from the shelter, a grizzled old Labrador named Gus, who followed me around like a furry shadow, his loyalty unconditional. Some days were still hard. Grief doesn't vanish. It softens. It folds itself into the fabric of your life until it's simply another thread in the tapestry. But most days, I woke up feeling something I had almost forgotten was possible. Joy, unforced, unconditional, mine. One crisp autumn afternoon, I drove to the ocean, to the bench where Charles and I had once sat, dreaming young dreams. I sat alone this time, Gus's head resting heavy on my knee. The waves crashed against the shore, relentless and eternal, smoothing away the footprints left behind. I pulled the wedding ring from my pocket, turning it over in my fingers. Not with sadness, not with regret, with gratitude, for the love that had once been real, for the lessons that had shaped me, for the strength I had discovered buried beneath the rubble. I stood and walked to the water's edge. With a soft breath, I whispered goodbye, not to Charles, not to the past, but to the version of myself who had once thought love meant sacrificing who you were. I tossed the ring into the surf. It flashed once in the sunlight, then disappeared beneath the waves. I turned away without looking back. Some endings aren't tragedies. Some endings are the beginning of everything beautiful. 5 years later. The house I live in now is small, a cozy cottage tucked between tall oaks at the edge of town. It's not grand, not impressive by any standard, but it's mine. Every inch of it reflects the woman I became after the storm. Sunlight floods the kitchen every morning, spilling across the wooden floors where Gus, older now, slower, but still my faithful companion, stretches lazily in patches of warmth. The bookshelves are lined with novels, poetry, and journals filled with pages of my own scribbled thoughts. Fresh flowers sit in mason jars on the windowsills, the scent of lavender and rosemary perfuming the air. Life is quiet, but it is full. I still tutor children in the afternoons, and I've started hosting small writing workshops on weekends. Helping others find their voices has become one of the great joys of my life, and sometimes, on crisp Saturday mornings, I drive down to the ocean. I sit on that same bench, watch the endless push and pull of the tide, and marvel at how life, too, moves in rhythms, carrying things away, bringing new things back. I've traveled alone, something I once thought I'd never be brave enough to do. I've hiked mountains and stood at the edge of vast forests, feeling small but never insignificant. I've laughed around bonfires with friends who feel like family. Most importantly, I've built a home inside myself, a home that no betrayal could tear down, no storm could shake. Love came back into my life, but not in the way I expected. Not the sweeping romance of youth, but slow, sturdy, patient love, the kind that grows in its own time, asking nothing but truth in return. It started with friendship, with long conversations over coffee, with shared laughter, shared silences, and a respect that ran deeper than any words. When I look into his eyes, a kind man named Daniel, who came into my life not to complete me but to walk beside me, I know this. I am not a woman who needs saving. I am a woman who saved herself, and that, more than anything else, is my happy ending. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below. Remember to like and subscribe for more real moving stories of strength, hope, and healing.